Put that axe down right now. This isn't a lumber yard. The voice snapped from behind me like a whip. I turned, sweat dripping down my neck, the axe frozen mid-swing, and there he was. Richard Hanley, the HOA president, standing on my back lawn like he owned it. His face was flushed red, his clipboard clutched against his chest like a weapon, and that smile, told me everything I needed to know about the kind of man he was. It was just past 7 on a crisp Saturday morning. The smell of fresh pine filled the air, and every swing of my axe echoed through the quiet of Maple Ridge Estates. It was one of the few things that made me feel normal again. After losing my husband, David, 2 years ago, I'd moved here looking for peace, a smaller town, a smaller home, and a slower life. My backyard became my sanctuary. The rhythmic thud of splitting wood wasn't just about staying warm in winter. It was therapy. But apparently, therapy was against the rules. Richard stepped closer, his loafers sinking slightly into the damp soil. "You're disturbing the neighborhood," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Chopping wood in plain view of other homes violates Section 8B of our community aesthetic guidelines." I blinked. "Excuse me?" I gestured to the open woods behind my house. "I'm on my own property. There's no one even close enough to see me." His eyes flicked toward my stacked logs, lined neatly along the fence. "We value uniformity here, Mrs. Benson. You can't just turn your backyard into a pioneer's camp. It lowers property values." For a moment, I just stared at him. This man who thought a pile of wood was a threat to his perfect little world. Then, I laughed. I couldn't help it. "Richard, right? Do you hear yourself? It's Firewood, not a junkyard." The laugh must have bruised his ego because his expression hardened instantly. He adjusted his HOA badge like it gave him authority. "You'll be receiving a notice. If you don't comply, fines will follow. I suggest you keep things tidy." He gave one last look at my axe, a look that felt more like a challenge, then turned on his heel and walked away, muttering something about non-compliant residents. I stood there, staring after him, my heart pounding not with fear but irritation. I wasn't the kind of woman to be bullied by a clipboard. If Richard Hanley thought a widow chopping her own firewood was a violation, he was about to learn what real defiance looked like. That afternoon I stacked every log higher, tighter, prouder. Neat rows of split pine glowing golden in the fading sun. The smell of resin clung to my hands, and for the first time since my husband's passing I felt steady again. There was something deeply grounding about building something tangible, something mine. But that night, the air felt different. Still. Too still. Around midnight, I woke to a faint noise. The gia, crunch of gravel, slow and deliberate, right outside my window. I held my breath, my ears straining. There it was again. Footsteps. Then the soft metallic clink of something against wood. I crept to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see the edge of my yard. The moonlight cast long, thin shadows across the ground. And there, by the fence, a figure moved. Tall, broad shoulders. He bent down near the woodpile, the beam of a small flashlight trembling across the logs. My stomach tightened. For a second, I thought about calling out, but the figure straightened suddenly, turning his head toward the house. I ducked down instinctively, heart hammering. When I looked again, the light was gone, and so was he. The night went silent once more, but my peace was gone with it, because deep down, I already knew who it was. A loud clunk jolted me awake. Through my window, a flashlight beam flickered, and someone was hauling my firewood into a pickup. When I saw the license plate, my blood ran cold. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. My mind raced trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The cold light swept across my backyard like a slow searchlight, landing on the neat stack of logs I'd spent days splitting. Each piece, the sweat, the ache, the pride, was being tossed into the back of a dark green truck. The emblem on the door gleamed in the moonlight. Maple Ridge HOA. I pressed my forehead to the glass, my breath fogging up the pain. My pulse hammered so loud I could hear it. The man moved fast, deliberate, heavy boots crunching against the frosted grass. He wasn't some random thief. He knew exactly where to go, exactly what to take. The flashlight swung upward for just a moment, catching his face. I froze. Even in that faint silver glow, I knew those sharp cheekbones and that stiff jaw. Richard Hanley, the HOA president himself, stealing from me in the dead of night. A mix of anger and disbelief surged through me. I grabbed my phone and dialed the sheriff's office. A woman's calm voice answered. I stumbled over my words, whispering as I described what was happening. Someone's stealing from my property right now. I can see him loading wood into a truck. It's marked HOA. She paused. Ma'am, if this involves an HOA or a property dispute, that would be considered a civil matter, not criminal. You'll need to resolve it with your homeowners board. I felt my stomach drop. He's stealing from me. How is that civil? I'm sorry, ma'am. Unless there's a threat to your safety, there's not much we can do tonight. The line went dead with a polite click, leaving me standing in the dark, trembling with frustration. I watched helplessly as Richard climbed into the truck, adjusted his collar, and drove off. My firewood rattling in the bed behind him. The sound of those logs bumping together followed me long after the headlights disappeared down the road. I couldn't sleep. After that, I sat at the kitchen table until sunrise, the smell of cold coffee filling the air. By the time the morning light spilled through the blinds, I'd convinced myself I must have overreacted. That maybe it wasn't him. Maybe there was some misunderstanding. But when I stepped outside, any trace of doubt vanished. Half my woodpile was gone. The ground was scarred with tire marks, the frost crushed into mud, and taped to my porch railing was an official HOA notice printed on crisp white paper. Violation 1222219. Unsightly debris in visible yard area. Immediate cleanup required. I stared at it, heat rising in my chest. The audacity was almost laughable. He'd stolen my wood, then fined me for it. I tore the notice off and crushed it in my hand. The air was sharp, the scent of pine and diesel still lingering faintly from the night before. For the first time since David's death, I felt something stronger than grief. Fury. Pure, steady, righteous fury. I knew what men like Richard thrived on. Control, intimidation, silence. But if he thought I was going to roll over, he didn't know me at all. That afternoon, I drove into town and bought 3 motion-activated trail cameras. As I held the boxes in my hands, I felt my pulse steady again. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, I'd play smart. Next time he came for my wood, I'd be ready. Gotcha. I whispered it to myself as the footage played. And there he was, the same man who fined me, caught red-handed loading my logs into the HOA truck at 2 a.m. The trail camera's infrared light flickered across the screen in shades of ghostly gray, and there stood Richard Hanley, the self-proclaimed enforcer of Maple Ridge's standards. The timestamp blinked mockingly in the corner. 2:03 a.m. He moved with purpose, glancing around like a thief who believed himself untouchable. He hoisted each log into the truck bed, humming faintly, oblivious to the fact that his smug face was being recorded. I sat frozen at my kitchen table, the faint buzz of the camera's audio filling the silence. There was no doubt anymore. It was him. Not a worker, not a misunderstanding. The HOA president himself had trespassed on my property and stolen my wood. For a few seconds, I just stared, the kind of rage that makes your hands tremble coursing through me. My husband David used to say, "When someone shows you their true colors, don't argue, document." I could almost hear his voice now, calm and steady, pushing me to act smart, not loud. The next morning, I called Mark Taylor, David's best friend and the closest thing I had to family left in town. Mark was a handyman, practical, patient, and loyal to a fault. When he walked through the door, his boots tracked a faint trail of sawdust across my floor. "Laura, you look like you've seen a ghost," he said. "Worse," I replied, sliding the tablet across the table. I've seen a thief. He squinted at the footage, his brows furrowing deeper with each passing second. That's Richard Hanley, isn't it? Sure is. The man who fined me for stacking the same wood he stole. Mark let out a low whistle. You've got him, Laura. Dead to rights. He spent the next hour helping me angle the cameras better, adding a few on the fence posts and one tucked inside a birdhouse aimed at the driveway. Before he left, he bent down near the gate, running his fingers through the dirt. Look here, he said, pointing. Tire tracks. Heavy tread. Same direction every time. The next morning, we followed those tracks in Mark's truck. They curved out of my lane, down the cul-de-sac, and ended behind the HOA clubhouse, where an old maintenance shed sat half hidden by pines. Piles of split wood, mine, were stacked behind it, along with bags of mulch and paint cans. Anger burned low and steady in my chest as I took photos. This wasn't just petty theft anymore. This was organized. At the next HOA meeting, I walked in with my head held high. The room was filled with the usual murmurs and forced smiles, the scent of burnt coffee hanging in the air. Richard sat at the head of the table, flipping through a binder like a judge about to deliver a sentence. I didn't wait for permission. Richard, I said loudly, placing my tablet on the table and hitting play. The footage filled the room, that grainy image of him stealing in the dead of night. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone gasped. Another whispered, "That's Hanley." But Richard didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, that same oily smile spreading across his face. "Be very careful, Mrs. Benson," he said smoothly. "What you're doing here, accusing a board member without proof, that's defamation. And that can result in significant fines." He stood and slowly walked around the table until he was just inches from me. The air between us felt cold and heavy. His breath smelled faintly of coffee and arrogance. Then he leaned in close, his voice dropping low enough that only I could hear. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. Violation. Violation. Violation." 3 envelopes slammed onto my doorstep in one morning, each one signed by the man who stole my wood. The red ink bled across the white paper like a threat. Mailbox paint color not compliant. Lawn exceeding regulated height. Unauthorized birdhouse structure visible from the street. 3 absurd fines, back to back, all dated the same day. I stood there on my porch, shivering in the early chill, holding those papers in one hand and the steaming mug of coffee in the other, realizing this wasn't coincidence. This was retaliation. Richard Hanley wasn't satisfied with stealing my firewood. Now he wanted to burn me down, piece by piece. I walked through my front yard, eyes scanning for anything remotely non-compliant. My lawn was trimmed neatly. My mailbox was the same white every other one was. And that unauthorized birdhouse? It was the same one my husband had built years ago. The same one that had hung there since before I moved in. By noon, I'd already gotten 3 emails from the HOA office. Each was polite on the surface, but carried the same smug undertone. Your violations must be addressed within 7 days to avoid further penalties. I could practically hear Richard's voice in every word. That afternoon, while I watered the small row of daisies near my porch, my neighbor, Janet Cole, walked by. She usually waved, but this time, she only offered a stiff nod before turning away. A few houses down, 2 others stood talking, their whispers breaking off the moment I looked their way. It didn't take long for the whispers to reach me. "She's unstable," they said. "She's paranoid about the HOA. She's making up stories about Richard. Richard was poisoning the well, spreading lies before I could tell the truth. That's what manipulators do. Isolate the target before the fight even begins." By sunset, my stomach churned with frustration. I grabbed the latest violation letter, flipping it over, scanning the fine print. All violations subject to board review upon written request. I knew that phrase. I'd seen it before in a legal pamphlet my husband once kept. So I sat down, pulled out my laptop, and looked it up. Legal nugget. In most states, HOAs can't just fine you without process. They must give written notice, a chance to be heard, and proof that a rule was actually broken. Otherwise, it's not a fine. It's harassment. I printed that law out and slid it into a folder. My next move would be careful. If Richard wanted to play legal games, he'd pick the wrong widow. That night, I sat by the window again, watching the soft glow of porch lights across Maple Ridge Estates. Everything looked so normal. Kids' bikes on lawns, dogs barking, sprinklers misting the sidewalks. But I could feel it, something rotten beneath the perfect surface. Mark stopped by after dinner, his truck headlights sweeping across the yard. He handed me a manila envelope. "You're going to want to see this," he said, his voice low. Inside were printouts from the local business registry. Richard's brother, Dean Hanley, owned a small firewood and landscaping company just a few towns over, Hanley Outdoor Supply. They sold premium split firewood by the cord. I looked at Mark, jaw tightening. "He's been stealing it from here," I said flatly. Mark nodded. "Looks that way." I leaned back in my chair, the full scope of it settling over me. The theft, the fines, the gossip. Richard wasn't just protecting HOA rules. He was protecting a side hustle built on intimidation and stolen property. As the clock ticked toward midnight, I heard it again. The faint rustle at my front door. A shadow passed across the glass, followed by a soft thud. When I opened the door, no one was there. Just an unmarked envelope lying on the mat. Inside, a single sheet of paper with shaky handwriting read, "He's been stealing from everyone. Check the HOA shed. Before Friday." A single folded note slid under my front door. "He's been stealing from everyone. Check the HOA shed. Before Friday." I stood there in my hallway, staring at the words written in shaky black ink. The handwriting looked rushed, desperate, maybe even scared. Whoever left this knew something and wanted me to find out before Richard Hanley covered his tracks. My heart hammered as I read it again and again, my fingers trembling slightly. That night, I called Mark. "I got something," I whispered, "but we need to move fast." We met the next evening at dusk. The air hung heavy with humidity, the scent of rain-soaked earth thick in the air. The HOA shed sat at the far end of the clubhouse property, a small steel structure half hidden by pine trees. Officially, it was supposed to store lawn tools and maintenance supplies. Unofficially, I had a bad feeling about what we'd find inside. Mark killed the headlights as we pulled up behind a row of hedges. "You sure about this?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "No," I admitted. "But I can't sit around while that man keeps robbing people blind." We crept toward the shed, our shoes sinking softly into the damp grass. The building loomed larger up close, its padlock hanging open. I exchanged a look with Mark. This wasn't carelessness. Someone had been here recently. When we pushed the door open, the smell hit first. Damp wood, oil, and something else. Pine smoke. The beam from Mark's flashlight swept across the room, and my stomach turned. Rows of firewood stacked to the ceiling. Not just mine. All kinds. Fresh, aged, mixed types. Piles of gardening tools, rakes, and even a few bicycles leaned against the wall. But what stopped me cold were the boxes on the back shelves, filled with holiday decorations labeled with residents' names. Klein, Henderson, Martinez. "Good God," Mark muttered. "He's been taking from everyone." We moved quickly, snapping photos with our phones, documenting everything. Each click of the shutter echoed in the tiny space, bouncing off the metal walls. I felt like a journalist gathering evidence for the moment the whole story would break open. "Get a shot of that shelf," I whispered, pointing toward a stack of split logs marked with spray paint. The same kind of marking from my pile. Mark raised his phone, but before the camera could focus, a sharp click cut through the air, the unmistakable sound of a motion light snapping on outside. We froze. The interior glowed white as the light poured in through the window slats. Shadows moved across the grass outside, and a second later, a familiar voice barked, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Richard Hanley. He stepped into the doorway, one hand gripping the frame, his face twisting with fury and triumph. "Caught red-handed, huh? Trespassing on HOA property? That's a felony, Mrs. Benson." I steadied my voice. "Funny, Richard. I thought stealing from homeowners was the felony. His eyes narrowed to slits. You have no authority here. You're done. He pulled out his phone. Maybe I'll just let the sheriff handle this. For a moment, I thought he was bluffing, but then I saw him actually start to dial. Panic surged. I grabbed my camera and tried to back toward the door, but my sleeve caught a shelf, and my camera slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. As it hit, a heavy log rolled loose from the bottom of the pile, bumping against my foot. It stopped mid-roll, exposing something shiny on the underside. A small metallic tag about the size of a coin, stamped with a barcode. Mark knelt down, brushing dirt away. "Laura," he said, eyes wide. "This one's tagged. Look. Property of county parks." I turned toward Richard, whose confident expression faltered for the first time. "What's that doing here?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer. He just stepped back into the shadows, muttering something under his breath as he disappeared into the night. When I flipped that one strange log over, I saw a barcode. Property of county parks. My stolen woodpile had just become evidence of a bigger crime. I stared at that tag, the metal cold beneath my fingers. The faint engraving shimmered in the flashlight's beam. It wasn't mine. None of the homeowners had marked their firewood with government property stickers. This was county-issued. Suddenly, the entire theft took on a different shape. Richard wasn't just pilfering from residents. He was stealing from the county itself. Mark crouched beside me, his voice low and steady. "Laura, this isn't just HOA nonsense anymore. This is criminal." He was right. I carefully snapped a close-up photo of the tag, zooming in on the barcode. I didn't know yet what it meant, but I knew who would. The next morning, I called the sheriff's office again. This time, I asked for Deputy Fields directly, a name I'd overheard a few times in town when people talked about someone who actually listened. When he picked up, I wasted no time. "Deputy, this is Laura Benson from Maple Ridge Estates. I've got something you'll want to see. It's connected to stolen county property." There was a pause on the other end, then a gravelly sigh. "You said you've got proof?" "Photos, tags, and the man behind it." Within an hour, his cruiser pulled quietly into my driveway. Fields was in his 50s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of calm that made you want to trust him. I handed him the photos, explaining everything from the midnight thefts to the HOA shed. He studied each image, his brow furrowing deeper. "County parks logs," he muttered. "These were supposed to be used for the trail restoration project. We reported a batch missing last month." "So he's been stealing from both homeowners and the county?" I asked. Fields nodded slowly. "Looks that way. If he's been reselling this through his brother's business, that's not just theft. That's wire fraud. Mail fraud too, depending how they moved the money." He asked me to show him the shed, so we drove out together. The structure was locked now, and a fresh padlock had been installed. But Fields took one glance at the tire tracks leading to it and smiled grimly. "He's covering his tracks." "Good. Means he's nervous." As we stood there, the air thick with pine and tension, Fields outlined his plan. "If I go in guns blazing, he'll claim misunderstanding. We need something bigger, a direct link between him, the stolen goods, and that business." That afternoon, we did some digging. Through public records and Mark's help, we traced Hanley Outdoor Supply, Richard's brother Dean's business. Over the past 6 months, the HOA had purchased several loads of wood and landscaping supplies from Dean's company, all paid through HOA funds. I recognized the transactions. They'd been slipped into newsletters under maintenance expenditures. The numbers didn't lie. It was a perfect little loop. Richard ordered the wood using HOA money. Dean delivered it, and then Richard stole more from residents to resell later, double-dipping while hiding behind bylaws. Legal nugget: when HOA funds are used for personal gain or criminal resale, it falls under federal mail or wire fraud, a felony that can carry serious prison time if interstate transfers or electronic transactions are involved. I felt a rush of adrenaline. For the first time, I wasn't just defending myself, I was exposing something bigger. Fields looked at me with a faint smile. You've done half my job for me, Mrs. Benson. Now let's see if we can make him hang himself with the rest. I raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? He leaned closer, his tone quiet but deliberate. He thinks he's smarter than everyone else. Let's bait him with what he wants most. Your woodpile. The words hit me like a spark. The plan was dangerous, but brilliant. Are you asking me to set a trap? I said. Fields grinned faintly. That's exactly what I'm asking. You sure you're ready for this? Deputy Fields asked, crouched behind his cruiser. I nodded, stacking one last GPS-tagged log. Let's see how much he wants my firewood tonight. The cold air bit at my cheeks as I adjusted the final log in the pile. Each piece had a tiny tracker hidden inside, programmed to ping the moment it moved. I'd spent the whole afternoon preparing, stacking the wood just so, making the bait look natural. My gloves were stiff with frost and the ground crunched under every step I took. This wasn't just about catching a thief anymore. It was about reclaiming control over my own life. The deputy double-checked the small receiver in his hand. Every log's transmitting, he said. Soon as they start loading, I'll get a location alert. Mark stood nearby, his breath forming faint clouds in the air. You sure you don't want me to stay? He asked. I gave him a thin smile. No. If something goes wrong, I need someone who can call for help. He hesitated before nodding. You've got this, Laura. When they both drove off, the silence of the night settled in like a heavy blanket. Maple Ridge Estates looked peaceful. Too peaceful. Porch lights glowed faintly in the distance, and an owl hooted somewhere beyond the tree line. I could feel my heart thudding beneath my jacket, the rhythm matching the steady tick of the clock in my kitchen. Midnight crept closer. The trail cameras were positioned perfectly, one angled toward the driveway, another on the back fence, and a third camouflaged in the flower bed. My phone screen glowed faintly beside me, streaming each camera's feed. The only movement came from a stray cat wandering across the yard, and then I saw it. A pair of headlights turning onto my street, cutting through the darkness like twin daggers. My pulse spiked instantly. The truck rolled in slow, deliberate motion, its engine rumbling low and smooth. I recognized that sound, the same truck from the last time. The HOA emblem had been peeled off, but the dents on the door were unmistakable. I ducked behind the living room curtains, keeping my breathing steady. The truck coasted to a stop right by my fence. For a moment, the engine idled. Then the lights clicked off, plunging the yard into darkness. The sound of doors creaking open followed. One, then another. Heavy boots hit the ground. Not just Richard this time. More than one set of footsteps. Through the narrow gap in the curtains, I watched shadows move toward my woodpile. The moonlight caught a flash of Richard's face. That same cold confidence, that same smug tilt of his chin. He looked like a man on a routine errand, not a criminal. But behind him were two others, silhouettes moving quickly, talking in hushed voices. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. Deputy Fields' cruiser sat hidden 2 blocks away. Engine off, lights down. The second I texted him the code word, he'd be here in minutes, but I couldn't risk tipping my hand too early. One of the men lifted a log, testing its weight before tossing it into the truck bed with a dull thunk. The sound echoed through the quiet street, each impact making my stomach tighten. I held my breath as the camera feeds flickered. The trackers were live. The moment they started driving, Fields would follow the signal straight to them. Richard's voice cut through the silence, low and commanding. Hurry up! We don't have all night. The other men grunted in response. One laughed nervously. Another muttered something about splitting it up later. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. This wasn't just about my woodpile. This was organized theft. Planned. Profitable. My fingers hovered over my phone, ready to send the message to Fields. But just before I hit send, one of the men stepped into the open. The porch light caught his face for half a second. County maintenance uniform, the same patch I'd seen before. They weren't alone. I typed the message fast, my breath fogging the window. They're here, 3 of them. Then I hit send and waited for the lights to explode behind them. 3 silhouettes stepped out of the dark, one in a county vest, one in a hoodie, and the last, Richard Hanley, the HOA president himself. "Grab the rest," he ordered. I crouched low behind my living room window, heart pounding so loud I could feel it in my throat. The glow from the truck's dome light flickered over them as they moved with practiced precision. This wasn't the first time they'd done this. Their routine was almost rehearsed. One man lifted, another stacked, and Richard supervised, keeping his voice sharp and quiet. I texted quickly, "They're here." 3 of them. The screen lit up with the delivered notification. Somewhere down the block, Deputy Fields was watching that same message light up on his phone. I hoped he was already moving. Outside, the thieves worked fast. The man in the county vest, his name tag barely visible, grunted as he lifted each log. "How many cords tonight?" Richard glanced at his watch. "Same as last drop. Dean wants the truck loaded before 2. Dean. His brother. The connection confirmed right there in the open. I grabbed my phone, thumb trembling as I hit record. The camera zoomed in on Richard's face. The same man who fined me for leaving a rake outside, now running a full-blown theft ring from my yard. Mark was watching too. Across the street, his truck sat parked behind a hedge. I could see the faint glow of his phone as he filmed everything from another angle. The cold air outside carried every sound. The shuffle of boots, the clink of the tailgate, the thud of each log landing in the truck bed. Frost sparkled on the grass like tiny mirrors, catching the faint moonlight. Every movement felt stretched thin with tension, every second slower than the last. Then I heard them talk again. Low voices, but clear enough to catch. "Dean said we got one more delivery after this," the man in the vest said. "He's got a buyer in Pine Hollow." Richard scoffed. "Then we're done. The HOA money runs out next week anyway. We'll pull one more batch and move on." The man in the hoodie chuckled. "Can't believe these idiots pay dues for this." The words made my blood boil. These weren't just thieves. They were predators feeding off a community's trust. I zoomed in closer, every muscle in my body tensed. My mouth was dry, my palms slick. I didn't dare move, afraid the sound of my heartbeat alone would give me away. Down the street, a faint hum cut through the quiet. The steady rumble of engines. At first, I thought it was another vehicle passing by. Then I saw it, the distant glint of chrome under streetlights. 2 sheriff's cruisers, lights off, rolling slow, quiet, deliberate. Richard didn't notice. He was too busy directing the others, stacking the last few logs with a kind of greedy satisfaction. He even wiped his hands on his jacket like a man finishing honest work. And then all at once, the silence shattered. Floodlights exploded across my yard. Red and blue strobes pierced the darkness. "Sheriff's Department," a voice boomed through a loudspeaker. "Step away from the vehicle and put your hands where we can see them." The men froze. The one in the vest dropped a log with a thud. The man in the hoodie bolted left toward the ditch. But Richard, he didn't freeze or run toward the road. He did something worse. He grabbed one of the remaining logs, one from the top of the pile, and clutched it to his chest like it was gold. His eyes darted toward the woods behind my house. "Don't move!" an officer shouted. But Richard was already running. He sprinted through the yard, boots pounding against the frost, his breath visible in the cold air. The log thumped against his arm as he stumbled through the trees, branches snapping under his weight. I pressed closer to the window, my pulse racing. Deputy Fields and 2 other officers gave chase, flashlights bouncing wildly in the darkness. I couldn't see much, just the distant beam of light weaving through the forest and the sound of shouting fading into the night. And then from somewhere deep in the trees came a single sharp sound, a crack, followed by a scream that echoed through the cold air. The log he'd taken wasn't just any log. It was the log, the one with the tracker inside. The second Richard lifted that heavy log, a piercing beep split the air. Then a burst of blue dye exploded across his face. He screamed, "What the hell is this?" The sound tore through the night like a siren, followed by chaos. The dye pack, rigged inside that single hollowed-out log, burst in a blinding cloud, coating Richard's jacket, gloves, and face in brilliant, glowing blue. He stumbled back, cursing and clawing at his skin as the tracker inside started chirping louder, each pulse flashing red against the darkness. Deputy Field's plan had worked perfectly. The log wasn't just a decoy, it was evidence in motion. Inside, a GPS unit tracked its location in real time. A dye pack marked whoever touched it, and a miniature recorder captured every word. It was foolproof, and Richard had just fallen for it head first. The flashlights appeared seconds later. "Sheriff's Department, don't move." Fields's voice thundered across the yard as he charged through the frost-covered grass, his boots crunching in rhythm with two deputies behind him. Red and blue lights lit up my house like a storm of justice. The man in the hoodie tried to run but slipped on the icy lawn, hitting the ground hard. The one in the county vest dropped to his knees instantly, hands raised, babbling that he was just helping with deliveries. But Richard, even covered in dye, blinking through the haze, still tried to bluster his way out. "You can't do this," he shouted, his voice cracking as deputies surrounded him. "She set me up. This whole thing's a setup." Fields didn't flinch. "You're right," he said coolly. "We set up a thief to catch himself." The deputy held up the small receiver that was still pinging steadily. "This log was marked, tagged, and tracked by law enforcement," he said. "We have video, audio, and GPS evidence of you stealing private and county property." Richard's eyes darted toward my house, fury replacing his panic. "You," he hissed, pointing at me. "You think you've won? You just made the biggest mistake of your life, lady. You have no idea who I know." "Save it," Fields interrupted, snapping cuffs around his wrists. "Right now, you're looking at multiple counts of theft, conspiracy, and misuse of HOA funds. You can name names later." The dye glowed under the deputy's flashlights, streaking down his collar like war paint. Even through the window, I could see it staining his skin. Bright, unmistakable proof. The image would stick in my mind forever. The man who had tormented me for weeks, now standing cuffed and humiliated in the same yard where he'd once barked orders. As they loaded the three men into patrol cars, I finally stepped outside. The air was freezing, but the adrenaline in my veins burned hot. The night was silent again, except for the fading static of the police radios. Fields turned toward me, his expression softening. "You did good, Laura. You kept your cool and gathered the proof." That's what nailed him. I nodded, though my hands were still shaking. "I just wanted him to stop." He gave a faint smile. "He will. And when this goes public, a lot more people will stop too." Legal nugget: property owners in most U.S. states have the right to record, tag, and track items stolen from their property when working with law enforcement. It's not vigilantism, it's lawful evidence gathering, as long as the methods don't endanger others. As the last cruiser pulled away, I stood alone on the frost-covered grass, watching the taillights vanish down the street. The woodpile, what was left of it, sat quietly beside me, my silent witness through every sleepless night. I thought that would be the end. But a few days later, as I sat sipping my morning coffee, there was a sharp knock at the door. When I opened it, a cream-colored envelope lay on the mat, embossed with the Maple Ridge HOA logo. The message inside was short, typed neatly in all caps. "Notice of special board meeting. Mandatory attendance. Resident Laura Benson." I stared at it, the familiar rage flickering back to life. They weren't finished with me yet. When I walked into the HOA meeting, every head turned, but when two deputies followed behind me, silence hit like thunder. The chatter that usually filled the community hall evaporated. You could feel the tension hum in the air, thick and electric. People sat frozen in their folding chairs, clutching clipboards and coffee cups, eyes flicking between me and the uniformed men at my back. For weeks I'd been the outcast of Maple Ridge, the unstable widow, the woman making up stories. But now, walking through those doors with the law behind me, I wasn't the pariah anymore. I was the reckoning. Deputy Field stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Evening, everyone. We're here on official county business regarding the activities of former HOA President Richard Hanley." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The word former landed like a brick. One of the board members, a wiry man named Todd Keller, who always played Richard's lapdog, stood up quickly. "This is highly irregular," he stammered. "The HOA board has its own process." "Sit down, Todd," Field said evenly. "Your process just became a criminal investigation." He opened a folder and began laying photos across the table. Still frames from the trail cameras, the GPS tracker data, copies of invoices from Hanley Outdoor Supply. Each image hit harder than the last. Richard stealing wood, forged HOA checks, falsified maintenance logs. The room broke into whispers. "That's our money. He's been billing us for years. My tools went missing last fall." I stood quietly near the back, watching their faces shift from confusion to horror. These were my neighbors, people who'd ignored me, gossiped about me, and now they were realizing that they'd been victims too. Mark, standing near the projector, clicked to the next slide. A video clip from my security camera. The grainy footage filled the wall. Richard in his HOA jacket, loading stolen logs into his truck at 2 in the morning. His license plate gleamed under the infrared light. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh my God, it's true." Deputy Field spoke again. "For those unaware, Mr. Hanley and 2 accomplices are currently in county custody. They face multiple charges, including fraud, theft, and misuse of community funds. The county will be conducting a full audit of Maple Ridge Estates accounts." The head treasurer, a woman named Donna Pierce, went pale. She stood clutching her papers to her chest. I didn't know," she stuttered. "He said all the purchases were for community landscaping." Another board member, red-faced, pushed his chair back so hard it toppled. "I resign," he muttered, storming out. Within minutes, 2 others followed. The mighty board that had lorded over this community for years was collapsing in real time. When it was my turn to speak, I stepped forward, my hands steady for the first time in months. "All I wanted was to be left alone," I said, my voice carrying through the quiet room. "I moved here to find peace, not to be bullied. But he didn't just steal from me. He stole from all of us, our trust, our money, and our sense of safety. I won't let anyone do that again." I played the final clip, the one of Richard screaming as the die exploded across his face. The gasps and murmurs that followed were a strange mix of shock and satisfaction. When the video ended, Deputy Field stepped back to the microphone. "If any residents have missing property or suspect false charges on HOA dues, please come forward. You have the legal right to request full access to all HOA financial records and to demand a third-party audit. That's state law." Legal nugget. Under most state statutes, HOA members, meaning homeowners, have the right to inspect financial records, question expenses, and call for audits. Transparency isn't optional. It's your legal protection against exactly this kind of corruption. The meeting adjourned in chaos. People gathered in small, stunned circles. Some hugged me, others simply nodded, too ashamed to speak. As I turned to leave, Fields's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then handed it to me. "It's for you," he said. I frowned, taking the phone. "Hello?" A calm, authoritative voice answered. "Mrs. Benson, this is the County District Attorney's office. We've reviewed the file. We'll need you to testify." The air seemed to thin around me. My fight wasn't over. It was only moving to a bigger battlefield. "Do you swear to tell the truth?" The bailiff's voice echoed. I raised my hand, looked straight at Richard, and said, "I've been waiting a long time to." The courtroom felt colder than any November morning I'd ever lived through. The pale light from the high windows washed everything in gray. The walls, the wooden benches, even the faces of the people who'd once called me a liar. I could see my reflection in the polished rail before me, my expression calm but iron hard. 2 rows over, Richard Hanley sat beside his attorney, still trying to hide behind that smirk that had once intimidated an entire neighborhood. But now in that courtroom, stripped of his title and power, he just looked small. The prosecution started with the financial trail. The county auditor took the stand first, laying out spreadsheets and printed bank records, pointing to transfers that matched Richard's signature. Over $16,000 in HOA funds were funneled into payments for goods and services never received. The prosecutor said, his tone steady but cutting. Those checks were deposited into accounts linked to Hanley Outdoor Supply, owned by the defendant's brother, Dean Hanley. Dean sat further back, slumped and pale, waiting his turn to testify. When the moment came, he shuffled to the stand, avoiding his brother's eyes. The tension in the room thickened, like smoke. "We had an agreement," Dean muttered. "Richard said it was all above board. The HOA bought wood, we delivered it, and that was that." "But you knew there was no wood to deliver," the prosecutor pressed. Dean hesitated, his voice breaking slightly. "I figured it out later. I told him to stop. He said if I didn't keep quiet, I'd lose the business." It was the deal breaker, the moment that shattered whatever defense Richard's lawyer had tried to build. His own brother, his partner in crime, had just turned against him to save himself. When it was my turn to testify, the clerk led me up to the witness stand. My palms were damp, my heart pounding. But as I sat down and faced the jury, something inside me steadied. I'd lived through sleepless nights, harassment, humiliation. This was the part where I finally got to tell the truth and make it count. The prosecutor approached the bench. "Mrs. Benson, can you describe how this all began?" I told them everything. From the morning Richard barked at me for chopping wood, to the night he stole from my yard, to the camera footage that caught him red-handed. I described the fear, the frustration, and the loneliness of being gaslit by an entire HOA board. I showed them the still photos, the dye-stained gloves, the marked logs, the GPS tracker. Every detail painted a picture of calculated deceit. When the defense tried to rattle me, I refused to break. "You're suggesting," the lawyer sneered, "that your actions were part of an investigation? That you had authority to track and tag this property?" "Yes," I said, voice steady. "Under supervision of the sheriff's department. Everything I did was legal, and everything your client did wasn't." A faint murmur of approval rippled through the courtroom. Legal nugget. Under U.S. civil law, victims of HOA fraud and theft can pursue restitution and damages through both criminal and civil courts. That includes reimbursement for stolen property, emotional distress, and misuse of community funds. Homeowners don't lose their rights just because they live under an HOA. By the time closing arguments began, the evidence was overwhelming. The jurors avoided looking at Richard. He sat stiff, jaw locked, his arrogance drained away. When the judge returned from chambers, everyone stood. The silence was suffocating. Then came the words I'd been waiting for. "We find the defendant, Richard Hanley, guilty on all counts." A wave of relief washed through me. I didn't cry. I just breathed deeply, fully, for the first time in months. As the bailiff led Richard away, he turned his head just enough to glare at me one last time. "You think this is over?" he muttered. I didn't answer. Because he was right, I wasn't done yet. The fire popped and hissed as snow fell outside. The same wood he tried to steal now burning bright in my living room. Justice has a sound, and to me it crackles. I sat on the rug, mug in hand, the orange glow flickering across the walls. The house finally felt warm again, not just from the fire, but from peace. For months, every creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind had felt like a warning. Now, each sound was a reminder that the storm had passed. After Richard's conviction, Maple Ridge Estates changed overnight. The board was dissolved by the county and rebuilt from scratch. The new president, a retired teacher named Linda Carver, came to my door one crisp morning, cheeks flushed from the cold, holding a clipboard and a pie. "We owe you," she said simply, "not just for catching him, for standing up when no one else would." It wasn't the words that hit me. It was the look in her eyes. Respect, not pity. The same neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid me now stopped by with small gestures of apology. A wave, a casserole, a few awkward words that always started with, "I'm sorry we didn't believe you." I didn't need their guilt, but I accepted their kindness. A week later, the county hosted a small town hall meeting. Deputy Fields spoke briefly, his presence calm as ever. "Funds recovered from the fraud have been redistributed to the affected residents," he announced. "Every homeowner who was fined or overcharged will be reimbursed." The room broke into applause. I just sat there, smiling quietly, my hands folded in my lap. For the first time, justice didn't feel like a headline. It felt real. When the meeting ended, Fields caught me near the door. "You handled yourself better than most," he said. "Most people would have walked away." "I almost did," I admitted. But then I realized if I stayed silent, he'd just find someone else to bully. He nodded, his eyes softening. "That's how people like him operate. They rely on fear. You took that from him." That night, I came home, built the first proper fire of the season, and sat in silence. The flames danced over the last of the wood Richard hadn't managed to steal. Every crack and spark felt symbolic, a reminder that what was once taken from me was now mine again. As I watched the embers shift and settle, I thought about everything that had happened. The fear that had once ruled my nights had turned into resolve. The woman who used to flinch at the sound of boots on gravel had learned to fight back. Not with anger, but with evidence, patience, and courage. Legal nugget. Every homeowner has the right to review their HOA's bylaws and request copies of them at the county clerk's office. Never take an HOA's word at face value. Verify their authority, understand your rights, and keep written records of every interaction. It's the simplest way to protect yourself from power-hungry leaders who think their titles make them untouchable. The firelight dimmed, and outside, the snow thickened. The neighborhood lay quiet, the kind of quiet that comes only after justice. Still, clean and honest. I thought about David, my husband. He would have smiled seeing me like this. Not as the scared widow who ran from conflict, but as the woman who stood her ground and reclaimed her home. I lifted my mug in a silent toast to him and to the peace we'd both earned. Tomorrow the HOA would rebuild, the community would heal, and the Hanleys of the world would have one less place to hide. But tonight, it was just me, the fire, and the sweet hum of freedom. What would you do if your HOA president tried stealing from you? I'd ask if this were a story told aloud. Share your story in the comments, and subscribe if you'd fight back. Because next time, the HOA didn't stop at stealing firewood. They came for the land itself.